languages the sources are written in, and what this means for the historian. As is widely known, there are numerous sources in Spanish, of course, that run the gamut from ethnographies to elaborate poems. There are also a smattering of sources in other European languages, including Portuguese, Italian, Dutch, and others. In terms of Asian languages, there's a small number of sources in Filipino, Tagalog, Visayan, and other Philippine languages from the period before 1800, although this increases, I understand, in the 19th century. There are also sources in less familiar, non-European languages. For instance, the National Archives of the Philippines contains documents in Arabic relating to the Sultanate of Sulu. There are also accounts of the Philippines in pre-modern Chinese geographical texts and bureaucratic documents, as well as texts written in Chinese by Chinese merchants. One very interesting example is what you see here on the screen, is a series of Chinese poems written for the death of the Spanish king Philip III, in which we find a very rare example of a barbarian, a non-Chinese monarch being referred to using the character Huang, emperor, a term usually reserved for the Chinese emperor alone. Now, as interesting and important as all these sources are, especially those in Spanish, and I'd be very glad to hear that Spanish is now required in the history course here, there's one group of sources that I don't think gets enough attention. These are the sources in Latin, written between the 16th and the 19th century. Since Latin was an important language of the church and higher education, these include, of course, textbooks for studying Latin itself, books about law and medicine, as well as sermons, poems, and prayers. Although these are not the only sources, as I'll describe in a minute. However, first of all, I want to deal with, let's call it the elephant in the room. Now, when many of you think of Latin, you might think of that famous chapter in the noong, where a certain arrogant padre tries to impress his congregation with his knowledge of the Latin language. I quote in the English translation, "Before he died, Diego de Alcalá spoke in Latin, without knowing Latin. Stand in awe, you sinners. Although you study and receive honors for it, you will never speak Latin. You will die without speaking it. To speak Latin is one of God's graces. The church speaks Latin. I myself speak Latin. What? God was going to deny this consolation, God was going to deny this consolation to his beloved Diego. He could die. He could let him die without speaking Latin? Impossible. God would not be just. God would not be God. He spoke Latin then, and the authors of the time all testified to it." Here, of course, Rizal is trying to make an important point about the attitude of many of the friars, who saw themselves as innately superior to their flocks, and so might have used this particular language of learning as a justification for it. We should not forget, however, that there were a growing number of Filipinos from the late 17th century onwards who also wrote, and yes, perhaps even spoke, Latin. Indeed, Rizal himself had studied Latin and read some of the most important Latin authors during his schooling, such as the poet Virgil and the orator Cicero, as well as having studied the classical art of rhetoric, as we learn from Rizal's schoolboy autobiography, in which he remembers, I quote, "Cultivating poetry and rhetoric had elevated my feelings, and Virgil, Cicero, and other authors, right, famous Latin authors, showed me a new path which I could take to fulfill one of my aspirations." Here, Rizal is also reminding us of a very important fact, namely that Latin was not just a language to be studied for basic communication, but formed part of a whole culture of learning that involved reading ancient Roman and later Catholic authors. Indeed, when we read a text in Latin, it is not enough to know what the words mean, but also to appreciate the direct references and fleeting echoes of famous texts that usually fill the pages. This is less the case in English and other modern languages, but it does happen sometimes. For instance, it is not uncommon for people to consciously or unconsciously quote Shakespeare when speaking English, peppering their speech with things like, "All that glistens is not gold," "Friends, Romans, countrymen," and one of my favorites, "Some are born great, others achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." You can change the greatness to other things. So some people are born mediocre, some achieve mediocrity, some have mediocrity thrust upon them. Right? People play with that. Imagine a language where this is crucially important. This is Latin. Okay? To give you a concrete example, I want now to turn to a little known, but I think very important Latin work written in the 18th century by another Filipino, the learned Tagalog priest Bartolome Sin. This work, which you see, this is the title page on the screen, and which is preserved in two copies, one at UST and the other in the National Library of the Philippines, is an epic poem about the British occupation of Manila during the 7 Years' War. As you can see from the title page, it is entitled simply Epigrammata. Yes, I've underlined that bit for you. Which means epigrams. That's to say it's a collection of poems on a single theme. Okay? We should also note that it is dedicated to the Lieutenant Governor of the Philippines, Simon de Anding Salazar. You see the name at the top there. Okay, you're already reading Latin, right? Simon Anda, right? And that it was printed thanks to the generosity of Diego de Los Angeles. Mateo de Los Angeles, there we go. A Chinese mestizo soldier. More importantly, however, for our purposes, is that it is, and my fellow panelists might correct me here, one of the earliest recorded works of poetry that we can be sure was written wholly by a Filipino. And it's in Latin, which is perhaps surprising. To give you some context to the epigrams and their author, Sin was born in 1694 in Antipolo to a family of Christian and Tagalog-speaking nobles, and then attended the Jesuit school in the neighborhood before receiving a bachelor's degree in arts from the Real Colegio de San Jose. From there, he quickly rose up in the church, eventually becoming the parish priest of Quiapo and a canon of Manila Cathedral. In the 1570s, which is when we sort of see him next in the history, he was asked to re-edit the Tagalog Doctrina Christiana. He's not only a Latinist, he's also an expert on the Tagalog language. If this were all Sin achieved, he would rightly be considered one of the most important Filipino intellectuals in the 18th century. However, in the 1750s, he also received another appointment as the official examiner in moral theology and Latin for those entering the priesthood. Any aspiring priest in Manila, be they Spanish, Chinese mestizo, or Filipino, had to pass through Sin. This Filipino priest thus became one of the few men in Manila who could officially test who could and could not read Latin. And we can speculate whether the padre described by Rizal would have passed this examination. Maybe not. Fast forward to the British occupation of Manila, we have accounts in both British and Spanish sources of an unexplained attack by British forces on Sin's church and the murder of several members of his congregation. As Sin was being bundled up to be marched into captivity in Intramuros, he was rescued by a band of Spanish and Filipino forces who were conducting a raid on British-controlled Manila for church bells, which they planned to melt down to make cannonballs to attack the British. Although liberated, as one Spanish source puts it, the parish priest of Quiapo recovered from his wounds, but not from the pain caused by the desecration of his church and the other aforementioned atrocities. This then is the immediate context within which we should understand the epigrams by this learned Filipino, whose command of Latin would have put the majority of Manila's Spanish priests to shame. These verses you see tell the story of the triumph of Catholic forces over a heretical and untrustworthy enemy, the Protestant British and their Indian allies. This victory was guaranteed from the beginning, so Sigurdsson says, by the virtue and piety of Andrew the governor and his Catholic Filipino allies, and foretold by the apparition of a cross in the sky above Manila, which mirrors the famous vision of the first Christian emperor of Rome, Constantine the Great, before the Battle of Millview Bridge. There are also other references to ancient Latin sources, including to Virgil, the author, you remember, praised by Rizal. For instance, Sigurdsson makes a reference to the very famous phrase of Virgil, "Love conquers all, and let us yield to love," but he changes it to "Love conquers all, the love of God and country." At the same time, the epigrams also comment on the complicated ethnic politics of the Philippines. On the one hand, the Filipino Latinist celebrates the ethnic groups who lived close to Manila and condemns the supposedly wicked inhabitants of distant provinces, such as Ilocos and Pangasinan, the sites, of course, of the famous revolts we associate with Diego Sibang and Juan de la Cruz Palares. On the other hand, the group for which he reserves the majority of his anger is the Chinese population of Manila. The Chinese, as some of you know, were the group that was widely believed to have collaborated with the British. Some, but certainly not all, did. And as a result, there were anti-Chinese riots after the British left, and many would later be expelled from the Philippines by the Spanish. Just to give you one example of Sigurdsson's feelings towards the ethnic Chinese population, in the 6th epigram, he asks rhetorically, "O Sangles, what frenzy lashes your souls and mysteriously overwhelms your hearts? Such madness digs for you wide graves." He continues, "Anda, the governor, sets upon them and hems in the beleaguered enemy. He captures many, those who did not flee." And the epigram then ends with an exhortation to Anda, "Exact the punishments that should be meted out to the depraved enemy. Put down the awful crime." So you get a sense of what he thought about it. Okay. So Sigurdsson's epigrams are therefore a very interesting moment in the history of the relations between the different ethnic groups in the Philippines, a history that has, of course, not always been rosy. So to wrap up then, when we think about the primary sources of Philippine history, I don't want you to forget about the small but significant number of sources in Latin. This was a language of learning not only in pre-modern Salamanca, Oxford, and Harvard, but also in the Philippines. This was a language written and perhaps spoken not only by Spaniards, but also by learned Filipinos, some of whom, like Sigurdsson, wrote poems that tell us a lot about his attitudes to religion and to ethnic politics in the Philippines. This is a poem that, if you're interested, you can download an English translation of via the link you see here, and I'm happy to send this to MD, and will soon also be published as part of a compilation of sources on Pacific history. This is the reference here. This is going to be published alongside a large number of very interesting sources in a number of languages. Otherwise, I hope when students think about the languages they want to learn to study the Philippines pre-1898, they will think not only of Spanish, Tagalog, Arabic, and Chinese, if they do not know them already, but also of Latin. Thank you.
We'll listen now to Professor Morley. Good evening. I'm going to continue the British invasion of Manila. Just a brief point of difference, though. Stuart is Scottish. That's why he's struggling with your weather. If you've been to Scotland, people sweat when it gets about 15 Celsius. I'm from the Mediterranean part of Britain. I'm English. I should say as well, we're both British, he's Catholic, I'm not, so I'm really the black sheep in the room. I'm the Protestant historian. Not many of those in the Philippines. But anyway, urban history, that's what I wish to talk about today, and in particular, maps. Just before I do though, a point of thanks to Jonathan. Thank you for organising everything. And I should say as well, thank you to Professor Ambeto Campo, who I first proposed organising an event like this on Facebook. And he very politely didn't tell me to go run and jump or swear. But anyway, so thank you to him as well. But thank you to you for turning up tonight. By way of introduction, I'll just say my name properly because it's amazing how many people from countries with Spanish histories can't say short names in English. Ian. Ian. Okay. I'm based, like Stuart, in the Department of History. I'm really a modern historian. And I'm often called an urban historian, but that characterization is not really correct. Urban history, where myself and Stuart are from, typically focuses on what you in the Philippines call social history or local history. Okay? In contrast to that, I call myself a planning historian. And usually when you say this in the Philippines, there's absolute confusion. Planning, history of planning, urban planning. And urban planning has an environmental design focus, and in particular I'm interested in the design of urban places in the American colonial era of this country. Now, to help you more fully appreciate what urban history is, I'm going to briefly describe it as being an academic field that seeks to do two basic things. On one hand, it seeks to analyse the design of towns and cities that developed in the past. In conjunction, it seeks to examine the persons or agencies who undertook the act of laying out urban settlements. In doing this, planning history explains the technical, the cultural, the legal, economic and political contexts that have shaped built environments' form and meaning. On the other hand, planning history explores what urban evolution was during particular periods of the past. It therefore seeks to clarify what agents and how acted upon the structural environmental development process. In doing this, what structural environmental continuities and transformations occurred during the past are revealed and, importantly, clarified. But akin to other fields of historical study, planning history relies upon the use of primary sources, particularly the use of maps. And they have two intellectual functions. The first is that maps show the morphology of the built fabric. They indicate the siting of spatial and architectural features within the urban environment at distinct points in time. In other words, maps, amongst other things, exhibit the historical layout of roads and public spaces and the siting of monuments as well as buildings of different typologies. But secondly, maps, when used in a chronological sequence, expose the permanence of natural and human-made urban features, and in association, the alteration of the urban layout through time. Such exposure aids inquiry into continuities and transformations that occur within urban settings, and importantly again for history, and why and how they link to the evolution of urban culture. But today, so that I can emphasize the value of maps to historical knowledge production, I'm going to very quickly cite Adam Shah's book, which is called Reading Architecture and Culture. Because Shah remarks that a city's appearance and plan are manifestations of the civilization that produces them. As buildings and spaces are therefore cultural artifacts, their character reflects the nature of the society in which they are found. Given this standpoint, in order to comprehend the history of, let's say, Metro Manila as a distinct urban and cultural environment, it is vital that we recognize the range of forces that have affected the character of its urban fabric in the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial past. In striving to know what its character has been and why it was that way, we should never overlook a basic tenet of historical study. A fundamental of history the subject, is that we learn the past to understand how the present has come into being. And by understanding what the present is, so in turn we can begin to see the direction of the future. History, therefore, if you study it comprehensively, is actually a futurology. Consequently, with this logic in mind, if we don't understand what made Manila's urban layout in the past, what it was, then how can we grasp what it now is? Besides, if we don't know what it is now, then simply we are not able to fathom what it will become in the years ahead. More to the point, we will never appreciate why built heritage exists and why it matters. Built heritage, of course, exists to provide physical representations of the cultural past, so that we today can better realize what society once was. At the same time, and thinking environmentally, without forming the intellectual means to link the past to present to future, we will never come to terms with why Manila has evolved during the past 5 centuries from being a planned city to its seemingly non-planned urban existence today. When I say non-planning, forget SM and its development. That's about the only example of of urban planning that you presently have in Manila. This transition from planning to non-planning is important to know because throughout civilization, the act of urban planning in this city has been an articulation of state authority. Yet, to go back to the topic of maps as tools for historical study, don't downplay their role in helping expand your knowledge of past society. However, I must add, similarly to other source types, maps need to be employed alongside other historical documents so that the facts of the past can be corroborated alongside other evidences. If we don't do this, we can run the risk of misreading what a map is presenting, and so likewise misunderstanding what urban civilization actually once was. And to help me express that point, what I'd like to do is provide you with a tangible example. If we consider an old map of Manila, such as the one you can hopefully see on your screen, it will display to us the existence of the walled city, the intramuros, and the city suburbs outside the walls, the extramuros. But as much as our eyes can see many features on the image, we need to realize that a map on its own cannot explain why Manila was designed in the spatial manner that we can see on the screen now. Okay, in the descriptive sense, we can say that Manila was developed from the late 1600s by the late 16th century by the Spanish with a grid plan, and it had walls about it. We can add that the walls were constructed for the purpose of defense, to aid urban defense. A fringe belt of moats and green spaces were added by the European colonizers. Yet walls, it must be acknowledged, act as well as icons of colonial authority. Their scale is important in this regard. Accordingly, we need to appreciate that as much as our eyes can see features on a map, they do not necessarily wholly inform us of the true narrative of life in earlier times. By way of example, to further emphasize the aforementioned matter, whilst the historical map of Manila can show us the locations and size of both the intramuros and extramuros, to know why their generic spatial configuration transpired necessitates familiarity with Imperial Spain's reduction policy, a strategy born from the law of the Indies so that different ethnic and cultural groups could be condensed into their own districts. Hence, given the nature of Spanish rule in the Philippine Islands, Spanish colonial era maps of Manila sought to demonstrate the spatial separation of the city's districts, given that the environmental, racial, and cultural divisions were the axioms upon which colonial society was built. If nothing else in this context, we must recognize too that to the Spanish colonial psyche, the different districts represented different levels of civilization. The intramuros represented high civilization, the extramuros represented something much less. More so, the surrounding countryside indicated the absence of civilization, which of course we know is not true in light of the presence of native culture. As such, to compare a map of Manila with, as an example, London, not only enables us to see different urban fabrics, but it also allows us, literally and figuratively, to identify the different natures of local society. London maps present a society with an almost exaggerated great proximity of buildings. And why? So that the map reader can easily gauge the high degree of social cohesion in the city. London, after all, was a city that prided itself, at least until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, as being a place where different social groups frequently intermingled and resided side by side. So moving forwards, how is it possible to comprehensively read a map for the purpose of developing historical analysis? Or put another way, how can you fully utilize maps as a tool in your historical learning process? To answer these questions, I will now explain a method of map usage, and to assist me, I'm going to use this particular map on the screen. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room, with the exception of me, has never seen this map before. It shows a district of Manchester in England during the mid-19th century. But before going into what this map environmentally presents as a primary source, there is a basic thinking and seeing process that can be acted upon in order to help you augment your knowledge building process. Start by spending a few moments to look at the image and identifying its basic character. Describe in your mind what you see. You can ask a basic question to yourself. For instance, what do you notice first? Why? Additionally, what other details can you see? Moving on, you can then spend a few more moments considering the map, but this time reflect on what you have just seen. In doing this, consider the map's purpose. Why do you think it was made? What do you think you can learn by looking at it, and in turn, by examining it? And finally, you can ask an additional set of questions. In English, to do this, we simply say who, what, when, where, how, why. I'm sorry, I don't know the Tagalog. Apologies. So, by shifting your mind from observing to evaluating and then to questioning, you can begin to break down what any map is. And so begin in conjunction to break down what information it visually contains about life in the past. Yet for students of history and teachers too, to deeply comprehend maps, there's another procedure that you can employ. Firstly, 1, label the map. By this I mean, what type of map is it? Is it military, topographic? Is it a weather map? Is it a political map? 2, look at the map's unique physical characteristics. Does it have a title? If so, what is it? Is the map maker's name given? Is there a legend? What is the scale? And what is the map's date? 3, building upon a description of any map's character, move into a point of analysis. To do this, list 3 things in a map that you think is important to knowing what life was once like. With this information, you can now begin to consider why the map was made. What is the map maker trying to show? What's more, what information is given within the map that complements data found in other types of historical sources? Put simply, how can you use a map alongside other historical sources at your disposal? And then 4, ponder the question, what is left unanswered about history by the map? As such, what else do you need to know so as to thoroughly appreciate what life was like for people who lived in the place, in this case on the screen that you see before you? So okay, with what I just said in mind, now let's practice that. Let's practice an analytical map reading procedure in relation to this particular map. So, what kind of map is it? It's a physical map.